So, good morning and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to begin, actually, and get this out of the way with some acknowledgments. This work was done for my PhD at Berkeley, supervised by Joe McBride, but all of this work was done at Humboldt State, just up the road here, supervised by Bill Big. We wanted to look at the growth of redwood seedlings under different light patterns and light conditions, and the context for this was kind of, I started to argue with both faculties at the schools of what the tolerance of redwood was. And I don't want this to devolve into a debate on the tolerance of redwood or where it's at, and it's kind of, you know, where it fits in succession and so on. But that's the context for this. So what I did is I used 5 seed sources to kind of have some external validity here from a variety of locations with a gradient in latitude and a gradient in elevation. You can basically ignore that. There were effects of that, but light overshadowed them. This was done, and I want to make this very clear, this was done in controlled environments. These were in growth chambers. Everything was controlled except humidity. So we controlled temperature, daytime temperature, nighttime temperature. They were planted in perlite and vermiculite. It was far from sterile, but it was clean. And these were fertilized. They were fully watered. They went up to field capacity every morning. But the key here is that we had 9 light treatments, 3 patterns and 3 intensities, with 40 seedlings in each treatment. Now hang on to that number of 40 for a moment, and also think about the light. So here are the light treatments. We had a pattern that we thought mimicked shade. We took values for light from the literature, as well as went out into the woods with photosensors. I built a bunch of them and parked them out there by Corbell and tried to discover, you know, what light levels were coming through in the forest for shade, and then tried to mimic sun flecks. The thought was maybe these seedlings are using these periods of bright light. And so I had this 16 hours of photo period. The sun flecks were every 2 hours, hour and 45 minutes, and then we just hit them with 15 minutes of high light. And then we had a pattern that mimicked large openings. 8 hours of highlight spaced between 2 4-hour blocks of moderately low light. Within each pattern then, we did intensities of 33, 66, and 100% light. This allowed us to kind of go right down here in the 33% of the shade to have a cumulative light of 1.6 Einsteins per meter squared per day. And Einstein is 1 mole of light between 400 and 700 nanometers. It's the photosynthetically active light for plants. All the way up to 15.5, a 10-fold increase in just cumulative light. And then delivered in each pattern 33, 66, 100, with an arrangement then of the light to give 5.1 Einsteins per day in each one of the patterns. So we could compare patterns, we could compare intensities within pattern, and we could just compare cumulative light. Now with all studies, as was mentioned in one talk earlier this morning, we had some problems. We had little effect of latitude and elevation, so I'm going to not talk about those today. And then the light pattern and intensity affected growth, morphology, and physiology to the point where we actually had a problem with time. But let me get right to this. If there's one slide that tells almost all the story, it's the next one, right here. Seedlings arranged by treatment. On the far left is the shade treatment, 33, 66, 100%. In the middle, 33, 66, and 100 of the Sun Fleck treatment. And on the right, 33, 66, and 100% of the large opening pattern. Just take a look at that. In every one of those, intensity increases growth, except for the large openings where the 66 and 100% trees are nearly identical at harvest. Now, our problem was those trees were growing so fast We were no longer dissecting them with the clippers. We were taking loppers to those things. I mean, if you look at this bar in the back, right there, that's 25 centimeters. I was getting redwood seedlings to grow over 80 centimeters in about 190 days. The second slide is a key slide. These are the same seedlings arranged by daily light from 1.6 to 15.5. The ones with the poorest growth, at least in height, and sort of almost the poorest vigor, is right there in the Sun Fleck, in the 33% Sun Fleck treatment. Whoa, the cursor is not working at all. Oh well. So second to the left in the Sun Fleck treatment at 33%. Now, I mentioned this problem we had with time. If we use time as covariate in these things, what we had was that the 33% treatment in the shade and in the Sun Fleck was significantly different. We let those seedlings grow much longer than those receiving more light. We had to. We couldn't do any analysis on them in terms of photosynthesis because they wouldn't fit in the cuvette. Their stems would be crushed basically by the sealant. And we had to get on with harvesting the other large seedlings because they were outgrowing the growth chambers and basically changing the light environment, as well as not going to fit in the photosynthesis cuvette. So within the equal light pattern too, we allowed the ones with the Sun Fleck in that treatment to grow much longer than the others. So many of these results, if they're in terms of growth at harvest, it would have been an even greater difference for those values than what you'll see here. So there's another part of the story here, the sample size. Remember I said hang on to that number of 40? Well, in the shade at 33%, we were down to 28 replicates by the time of harvest. Those seedlings were dying from damping off. And I replaced all of those seedlings up to 40 days. So we had everything at 40 days. There was a seedling within the treatment. But starting at 40 days and beyond, I did not replace them. And those trees were dying off from damping off. Also in the open, you'll see at 100% a sample size of 35, and in 6634, we had mortality in all the treatments, but in those, I was really starting to see sun scald on those seedlings, and the loss of those replicates were from almost too high a light. So we think we bracketed pretty well the cumulative light necessary for redwoods of having too low and having them susceptible to disease, and too high and not utilizing it, but actually being damaged by it. But we're not sure. I mean, that wasn't the main purpose of the study. So looking at height at 40 days. In every pattern, there's a significant difference between the 33% and the 100%. But notice in the open pattern, the third from the left, the trees receiving high light actually were shorter. Again, evidence that we were exceeding their light requirement and maybe even causing damage. And then what you'll see throughout is the shade and open-grown trees, very similar for the variable, and the Sun Fleck, in this case, those seedlings being much shorter. At 80 days, and 40 days was full replicate, now we're starting to see some mortality come in here. But shade, increase in height growth, Sun Fleck, increase in height growth. Notice here in the open pattern, intensity of light does not affect height growth at 80 days. And then in the equal light treatments, the shade, Sun Fleck, and open, the Sun Fleck's seedlings much shorter. At 120 days, increase in growth in all intensities across patterns. And notice that in that open light pattern, those 100% trees exposed to 100% light are now taller than the others. Height at harvest, here's where we have the problem with time And you would see an even greater difference in the shade in the Sun Fleck treatments, but very great differences there between the trees in the 33% treatments and the 100% treatments in both of those patterns. Caliper. Similar pattern to height in many ways, except that not an effect of time or not an effect of the intensity within the open pattern. In each case here, increased light increases caliper at 80 days, and within the equal light treatments, the Sun Fleck seedlings had less caliper. Similar story at 120 days. Caliper at harvest. Similar story again, except that in that open pattern, you'll notice that the trees at 66% and 100% intensity have virtually the same caliper. Primary branches at 80 days. So one of the thoughts was, well, are these things really changing branching? And yes, they are. Now, the unit for this is the number of branches per centimeter of stem. So they may have the absolutely same number of branches per seedling, but the thought is that the branches per centimeter of the stem indicates more kind of what they're doing in terms of branching. But notice that the trees grown under higher intensity light in all of the patterns put on more branches per centimeter of stem in each light pattern. And in the Sun Fleck pattern of the equal light treatments, significantly lower number of branches. Primary branches at 120 days changes a little bit. Significant in the shade pattern and the sun pattern with increases in light intensity. No difference there in the open. And then by that time, the shade trees in the equal light patterns had actually put on more branches per centimeter of stem length than either the Sun Fleck or the open treatment. Looking at longest branches, similar pattern. Branches grew longer with increased light in every one of the three patterns and grew longer in the shade and the open compared to the Sun Fleck pattern in equal light treatments. Similar at 120 days. So now we get to harvest, and here's where time kind of clicks in. Leaf area. Increased leaf area on seedlings in the shade, in the Sun Fleck treatment, and in the open, large opening pattern with increased intensity. Within equal light treatments, Sun Fleck seedlings had less leaf area. Leaf mass, similar story, except in the open light pattern, you can see that this trees growing at 66% and 100% have nearly the same leaf area. Specific leaf area at harvest. Now this is an interesting one because specific leaf area, the unit here is the area of the leaf per mass. So it's centimeters squared of leaf area divided by the grams of the leaves. In this case, they decline with intensity. In other words, and this is kind of one of these key slides, the trees receiving more light are able to build more infrastructure in their leaves. And you'll see this pretty soon in some cross sections of needles that I'll show you. They are able to build a much more robust leaf at high light. And that's consistent with what's found with other conifers. However, look again at the 66% and 100% of the large opening treatment there, virtually the same specific leaf area for both of those treatments, but significantly more or less than the 33% intensity treatment within the open pattern. And in the case of the equal light treatments, the seedlings in the Sun Fleck treatment having more specific leaf area. In other words, they're adding on a great deal of area without building infrastructure in the leaves. It seems to be an adaptation to collecting as much light with as little infrastructure in the leaves as possible. Mass at harvest, similar trend here. Increasing light allows those seedlings to grow more, greater mass, and we hit the peak there somewhere at that 66 to 100% intensity treatment in the open. And then in equal light, the trees with exposed to sun flecks as their pattern, less mass. Root mass, virtually an identical story. More root mass with increased light in every one of the light treatments, less root mass with the Sun Fleck treatment. Root-shoot ratio. Similar story again, except when you get into the equal light treatment, the Sun Fleck seedlings actually have a higher root-shoot ratio. I think that's an adaptation or a method to adapt to those periods of high light and the transpiration which must be occurring to photosynthesize in those periods of high light. Stomata increases again with increasing light, lower in the Sun Fleck treated seedlings in the equal light treatments. Needle length, not a difference except in the Sun Fleck treatment, and somewhat between treatments in the seedlings grown in the open. They had longer needles. Needle width, similar pattern there, except the shade trees had longer needles. Or I'm sorry, wider needles. Needle thickness increases in every light treatment, stays the same between all treatments with equal light. But the needle width to thickness ratio decreases with increasing light in every treatment. Flat stays the same between equal light treatments. Now, I'm going to skip through these really quick. We did photosynthesis. Just squint, look at the pattern, general pattern. There is a difference. Trees grown in the shade are not capable of photosynthesizing as rapidly as those grown in the open. Here they are in equal light. So those in the large opening, significantly greater maximum photosynthesis than those in the Sun Fleck and the shade treatment. So cross-sections of needles. Here's one from 66% open. The more dramatic one is from 100% open. Look at the development in the palisade parenchyma. That's stained with safranin, which would be staining lignin and other kind of structural molecules. There's a cross-section from 33% Sun Fleck and from 33% shade. Look at the lack of development of the palisade layer of cells. And then doing a magnification of that, this is from 33% shade. Note the prismatic cells in the epidermis, upper epidermis. It's actually thought to gather light, that diffuse light, reflecting in from the side of a stand, reflecting into the side of a needle, and focusing in that into the palisade layer. Here's one from 33% Sun Fleck. So take-home message, increased growth with increased light in all patterns. Light limit somewhere just around maybe a little less than 15 Einsteins per meter per day. And those 15-minute Sun Flecks were just not as well utilized as the consistent light. Even in the shade, often that 16-hour constant photo period was more effective for seedling growth than having those Sun Flecks interrupting that low light provided for that treatment. These things, redwood seedlings, Dr. Libby mentioned it this morning, don't really act like what we typically think is a tolerant tree. And I don't want to get into that debate. I've had that with multiple people. I'm not sure tolerance it's a useful concept, but it's just that. These trees act the way they want to, and redwood acts in a very unique way. I must add that all of this was done with seed sources up in its far northern range, and it may act differently in the southern part of its range. Thank you.